Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring to a conclusion an 8-week series of interviewing candidates for national, state, and local office. To close out our program on Sunday before the election next Tuesday, we are very happy to welcome to our program the senior senator from the state of Idaho, the Honorable Frank Church. Senator Church has been in the Congress of the United States since his election in 1956, and he was reelected in 1962, 1968, and 1974. This year he goes before the voters again to seek another term. He has a very distinguished background, including a bachelor's degree and a law degree from Stanford University, and during World War II he served in the Army, in the military intelligence in China, Burma, and India. While in the Senate, he has received not only national but international reputation for his work in the Congress of the United States, and much of that's come from certain committee appointments. The most prestigious committee of the Senate, and the one that he chairs, is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is also the ranking member and former chairman of the Senate Committee on Aging, and he is also a member of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources that affect much of the Pacific Northwest. He is married to Bethine Church, who we're happy to have with us in the studio today, and is with him throughout his tour of Idaho from year to year. I would also like to point out that Senator Church was the keynote speaker at the Democratic National Convention in 1960. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you.
Joining with me today in questioning our very distinguished guest is a regular member of the panel, Mary Lou Reed, holding a degree from Mills College and also did graduate work at Columbia University. Lou, please start the questioning.
All right. Senator Church, the Sagebrush Rebellion is proving to be a very large issue in this campaign. Can you tell us and our viewers why you consider the Sagebrush Rebellion to be a real threat to Idaho?
Well, Lou, nearly everybody I know thinks that Idaho is the greatest place in the country to live, and I agree. And the reason for that is not that our towns are so much different or our work so much different than elsewhere, but it's because we're blessed with a great expanse of public lands. Now, in part, we earn our living from those lands. The lumber industry has access to those lands for cutting logs. The mining industry has access to those lands for extracting minerals. The cattlemen and the sheepmen can graze their animals on the public lands. So, in part, it supplies our livelihood. But beyond that, because these lands belong to all of us, we have incomparable opportunity for outdoor life that comes to very few people in this country. Whatever you do in the outdoors, whatever your particular liking may be, you can find it in Idaho. If you're a hunter and like to hunt elk and deer, and here we have the season opening. If you're a fisherman, you know, there's the public land. If you're a camper who, like 2/3 of the people of Idaho, take a camping trip to one of the campgrounds provided by the Forest Service, you know, in our national forests, well, there it is. Or if you're a snowmobiler, or if you're a trail bike rider, or if you're a mountain climber, or if you're a person who likes to take his young family away from the macadam roads and the organized campgrounds and the hamburger joints and find a wilderness experience, whatever it is, it's the public lands that makes it possible. Now, that's our way of life. I believe that Idaho is what the country used to be, what the country would like to be again. And that's why I'm so much opposed to this Sagebrush Rebellion. If this ever gets off the ground, this movement, it will undermine and ultimately destroy the special quality of life in this state. It will turn this state into just another state, you know, where the people are kept off the land by fences and no trespassing signs. Because you see, the ostensible purpose of the movement sounds innocent enough. It's to move the ownership of these federal lands, which are now paid for by all the people of the country, not by the people of Idaho. We don't pay 0.5% of what it costs to maintain the national forests, for example, but by the people of the whole country. Idaho can't afford to maintain the lands, the forest highways, the access roads, the campgrounds, the network of public trails. It would cost this state an extra $130 million over and above all the revenues from these lands. That would mean a 40% increase in state taxes. Well, no legislature is going to do that. No governor is going to sign such a bill into law. What would happen is that great tracts of these lands would be either leased or they would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. And that's, of course, what the backers of the movement themselves have admitted. Senator Hatch of Utah, he's said that the ultimate purpose is to turn these lands from public ownership into private hands. And that won't be you or me. It won't be the people of Idaho. It'll be the land-hungry oil companies and outside interests. It'll be the Los Angeles realtors to carve out the most beautiful parts of Idaho. And then the people of Idaho will find out what a real lockup is all about. Now, my opponent, Steve Sims, is enthusiastically for the Sagebrush Rebellion. I'm against it. And as long as I serve in the Senate, no part of Idaho is going to be put on the auction block. As far as I'm concerned, Idaho is not for sale.
One of the observations that I've had during the campaign is the question of who can be most effective in serving the people of Idaho. We're a very small state and we do not have a large representation in the House of Representatives, and as all states, only 2 members of the Senate. I've seen in both your literature and your opponents some reference to this. As to both introduction and passage of legislation, what does it take to be effective in protecting Idaho and the Pacific Northwest interest?
Well, let's think about that. I think the people can figure it out for themselves when they consider that we have just 4 votes out of 535 in the Congress. Obviously, we can't depend upon our voting power. We don't have any. So we have to depend upon putting people in positions of influence in the Congress, positions of strength. The South learned that a long time ago, and for years the South dominated the Congress as a result. Now the power has been moving from the South to the Northwest. And because the people of Idaho have kept me in the Senate for 24 years, I've been able to climb the ladder from the lowest rung to the 7th from the top in terms of my seniority. That means I can get the job done for this state. I can get the legislation that we need. I don't brag about that. People have a right to expect it of me. They've kept me there long enough to bring home the results. Now, there are a lot of people who are just influenced by rhetoric, and I can't hope to reach them in this campaign. But the people who are interested in results for a small state, interested in protecting our vital interests like water and keeping it from being diverted into California, interested in avoiding the imposition of unwanted gun controls, people who really want results, they really have to depend on someone who's got the position to protect our interests, to keep Idaho from being pushed around in the nation's capital. Now, I am in that position, and that's why I can serve this state effectively in Washington. My opponent has been 8 years in the House of Representatives. In the course of that time, he's introduced 136 or 137 bills. He's yet to pass his first bill. He spent all that time talking about taking bites out of government and reducing the cost of government. He's yet to take his first bite. He's yet to reduce the government in its size 1 whit, because to do that you have to pass bills. You have to legislate. And he's flunked the course. And on the basis of having flunked the course in the House of Representatives, he now says, elect me senator. Promote me to the Senate. I think it's a very weak case. I think the people of Idaho can figure that out.
He's indicated that's because he's a Republican in Democratic Congress. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's another alibi that just won't hold up. It sounds good if you don't examine it. But the Democrats haven't prevented Steve Sims from passing any bills. You know, there are all kinds of Republicans who legislate, who pass bills in a Democratic Congress. We have already identified over 300 bills passed by Republicans in a Democratic Congress since Steve Sims was elected. No, to pass bills you have to have the confidence and respect of your colleagues in committee and on the floor of the House. You have to be able to get a majority to support you. And Steve Sims has been unable to do that. He hasn't had the legislative clout to punch his way out of a wet paper bag. And I hardly think that this is a strong case for electing him to the Senate.
Lou Reed.
My next question is about the commodities market. You have an ad that reads, it asks, who introduced legislation sought by Idaho potato growers to ban trading in potato futures? And then it asks, who took a fling in the potato futures market and bet that the price of spuds would go down? Now, many of us don't really understand the futures market, but we do understand that the potato is really pretty much a symbol of Idaho and important to our economy. Just what does that ad mean? What are you asking?
Well, the potato growers of Idaho want futures trading in potatoes banned because the speculators have hurt the price, have hurt the growers. So the Idaho potato growers came to me and asked me to introduce a bill that would ban potatoes from futures trading. Now, I did that with onions some years ago, and the onion growers of southwestern Idaho have been very pleased not to have onions on the futures market. Now the potato growers want the same. They want potatoes off the futures market. Steve Sims himself has been speculating on the futures market, and he did speculate in potatoes. He did bet that the price would go down, which seems a strange thing for a congressman representing Idaho to do. Had he won his bet, he'd made a mint of money, but the potato growers would have lost millions. I just think that Idaho needs someone in Washington looking out for the best interests of the farmer, not speculating against them.
Another thing in this campaign, and it's been true in some other states across the country, it's been a rather emotional year, and a number of committees have existed to deal with different campaigns that one might say did not deal with the major issues, but dealt with quite a bit of emotionalism. One group is out of Virginia, I believe, called, I believe it's the National Conservative Union for Political Action Committee, and there's a group, an ABC group in Idaho, and others. What do you think the role is of groups that are outside of the two camps of the candidates? Should they exist, and how should they conduct themselves in a campaign?
Well, the law permits them to exist, so we have to deal with them for what they are. Now, what is ABC? It's a front organization financed by NCPAC. The money comes from Virginia. The campaign against me is directed out of Virginia. And the man who's directing it all is Mr. Terry Dolan. Terry Dolan doesn't have a very high opinion of Idaho voters. He says his organization lies. He boasts about that. He says that they will so saturate Idaho with anti-church propaganda that people will vote against me and not even remember the reason why. He says that with his techniques he could elect Mickey Mouse to the Senate in this state. Well, I hope he's wrong. I think he's wrong. I have far too much respect for the judgment and intelligence of Idaho voters to think that they can be so easily manipulated. But Idaho is a test tube case. They have put me on the top of their list for political execution in November. They don't care anything about Idaho. They don't know anything about our problems or our people. They just want to use Idaho as a pawn on their political chessboard. They call themselves radicals, and they say their purpose is to change the power structure of America. And I think it's sad that Steve Sims has not been man enough to disassociate himself with this group and with its tactics. But he hasn't, though he's had plenty of opportunity to see that they were engaged in deliberate deception, a fact that's been proved again and again in the course of the last 18 months that they've been trying to control the politics of our state. And that's why I think it's going to backfire against him in the end and hurt him very badly. Idaho people, I think, are proud enough to want other organizations from out of state to leave us alone. The people of Idaho have the competence to decide for themselves who should represent them in the Senate and who can best do that job.
Lou Reed.
Your opponent has accused you of being soft on defense. How do you counter that charge?
Well, Lou, I counter it this way. Steve Sims would vote in knee-jerk fashion for every weapon that's proposed. That's the fastest way I know to bankrupt the United States. I'm for a strong, smart defense, and in the course of my career in the Senate, I voted for $1.7 trillion, some fabulous sum of money for defense, which hardly represents unilateral disarmament, another charge that he makes against me. This is all nonsense. You know, just complete nonsense. And we've got to start talking sense to one another. Why in the world vote for a B-1 bomber, for example, which the Air Force itself admits cannot penetrate Russian defenses by the time it's deployed to our Air Force? There's no reason to have a strategic bomber if it can't get through Russian defenses. Yet he would have us spend $125 million apiece to build a bomber that's obsolete based on the technology of the 60s, not the 80s. Why spend $3 billion for a new aircraft carrier and then $2 billion more, really, when you equip it with all the planes and everything else that goes with it, when we already have 13 aircraft carriers to only 2 that the Russians have? We don't need another. What we need in the Navy are fast, maneuverable missile ships that can get up out of the water and avoid the torpedo threat, that will be hard to hit. The Russians can't miss those carriers. They have 6.5-acre decks. Russian missiles can't miss them if it ever came to an engagement between our two fleets. So I'm for using some judgment in what we buy, not just, you know, voting for every weapon system proposed. I'm for cruise missiles. They can penetrate Russian defenses. I'm for a new bomber based on the technologies of the 80s, if it can penetrate Russian defenses. I'm for the Trident submarine, one of the best weapons we have in our deterrent force. But I'm not for just squandering money in the name of defense, which will only weaken the country in the long run, because it will contribute nothing to our defense to have obsolete weapons, and the cost is staggering.
Another issue that's been in this campaign in a number of sources, and also it was used by the Coeur d'Alene Press to endorse your opponent very recently, and that is the statements that are indicated that you have made concerning our policy towards Cuba and Castro. Is that an issue in this campaign, and would you like to explain?
Well, it certainly ought not to be an issue. I'm not surprised that the Coeur d'Alene Press endorsed Steve Sims. That was not an earth-shaking occurrence. It would have been if they'd endorsed me. but the reason they used really was mind-blowing. I went to Cuba on a presidential mission. I went there to see if I could get 40 to 50, about 100 American citizens who'd been stranded on that island for 17 years free. And I succeeded. You see, they couldn't leave the island because they didn't want to desert their wives and families. And Castro would not permit them to take their wives and their families with them. So I went there for 3 days. I did my best to establish a rapport with Castro in order to complete this mission successfully. You don't go there for that purpose and insult the man. I did accomplish the mission. The Americans were permitted to leave with their families. I'm very proud of that achievement. And for that to be used as the basis for endorsing Steve Sims is just comical, because he also went to Cuba and met with Castro and accomplished nothing, and then went on to other garden spots in the Caribbean in what is normally known as a congressional junket. I'd be glad to have the people of Idaho compare the two missions. I just wonder at a newspaper that is so ill-informed.
You're also wearing a pin on, this is a related issue in another part of the world. It says "Free the Hostages," and I believe you've been working on that issue recently. And as of the taping of the show, there's still hostages, but we're taping it
Yes.
2 weeks before it is to air. Can you bring us up to date on that issue?
Well, this Free the Hostage pin was given to me by the wives of the hostages, and They're a great group of women. They came to me and asked me if I would sponsor legislation, not for any special favors. They didn't want special favors, and least of all did they want their plight, the plight of their husbands, exploited for political advantage. So they said, we just want a bill, Senator, that will give our husbands equivalent treatment to what we give military personnel abroad. And that seemed very reasonable. And so we did draft such a bill. The problem that we had was to keep it from becoming a Christmas tree. And those women fought every amendment. They said, we don't want special treatment. We just want equal treatment. And so in the end we got the bill. We got a bill that does not tax them, for goodness sakes, while they're held hostage, that provides medical care for their needs when they're released, and which would also give them educational benefits like the GI Bill of Rights. And so they gave me this in appreciation for the work I did for them, and I'm very proud to have it. I'm the first member of the Senate to be given one of these lapel pins. We'll get our hostages back. I'm sure of that. Just when, just how, I cannot now predict because of the chaotic state of the political situation inside of Iran. But I have stressed with the President and with the Secretary of State that they should look upon the war between Iran and Iraq as a kind of opportunity to exercise some leverage on behalf of the hostages. And that is now in process, in train.
I should point out to the viewers that this show was taped on October the 21st, and it's so fast-moving something could happen.
That's true.
Before the airing date. Lou Reed.
Well, it's wonderful to hear those hopeful words about the hostages. At another point here, we've also been reading a lot of headlines about the controversy over your select committee that investigated the CIA. My first question is, do you really feel that your committee was able to help curb some of the abuses that were rampant in the CIA?
My committee helped preserve freedom in this country, and I'm very proud of its work. I just can't understand planted questions and setups of the kind that were caught by the American Broadcasting System, the network's newscast. That sort of political behavior is inexcusable. And for Steve Sims to plant the question and then have it thrown to Jim McClure and then to feign surprise when the question was asked, I really wonder whether people want that sort of, that kind of politics, that caliber of representation in Washington. But the charge itself is completely unfounded. It's not only the lowest blow I've ever known in Idaho politics, but it has no factual basis whatever. When we commenced our investigation, I had an understanding with Mr. Colby, the director of the CIA, I've got ABC on the mind these days, of the CIA, that no name of any agent, no assignment of any agent abroad would even be given to the committee because we weren't interested in having those facts. We didn't want ourselves placed in a position where it could ever be honestly said that something we did, some leak, some inadvertent slip, had affected or endangered the lives of any of our agents abroad. So we never had the information. It was never possible for us to have had any effect. There were books at the time, one by Philip Agee, who was an agent of the CIA, who left the CIA. He wrote a book, published it in England. It had all the names of all the agents in all the countries, and that information was available. That was a terrible thing for him to do, but our committee could not possibly have been connected in any way with that tragedy. And Mr. Bush, the Republican nominee for vice president, has said as much. So much for that charge. What we did accomplish was we put an end to abuses in this country. The CIA was not set up to spy on innocent Americans. And we found out that was what was happening. Opening of our mail, illegal wiretapping, illegal telephone tapping, illegal use of drugs on unwitting suspects with very bad effects on their health, and in one case a suicide. You can't let a secret organization operate outside of the law against your own people, against their constitutional rights. Once you let that happen, you start the countdown on freedom in America. So I'm not only proud to have conducted that investigation, to have been entrusted with it by my colleagues in the Senate, but I'm proud of the fact that its work is now on the agenda of many colleges as a model of how the Congress should conduct such an investigation.
Another major issue for Idaho certainly happened in this Congress, and that is the River of No Return Wilderness Act. And many people don't understand that there's two parts to that, major parts to that legislation, setting aside area and opening up other areas. In fact, when we deal with quality environment and also economic growth, they're both involved, as I understand, in this piece of legislation. Could you take just a moment to explain the two parts of that?
Sure. The legislation establishes a very fine wilderness, which is all for the good. It doesn't comprise much merchantable timber, but it's very remote land, fragile land, that it needs the protection of a wilderness designation. It'll be great for wildlife habitat and for recreation, and it's going to be the finest wilderness in the American West. Now, the legislation also releases 900,000 acres of land that heretofore have been administered as de facto wilderness, roadless lands, and that has all been restored to multiple use management, with the result that the Forest Service's own figures show that there will be more logs with the bill than there were before the bill. And thus, this will make an affirmative or a positive contribution to the lumber industry of Idaho. That's why the two lumber companies most closely affected by the bill endorsed it. And that, of course, gives the lie to Steve Sims's charge that this bill will somehow eliminate jobs. How could it eliminate jobs if it's going to make more logs available? I mean, it's a contradiction of terms, and it's consistent with the level of campaigning that he's been doing.
There are even provisions, aren't there, that mining and so forth could take place even in the wilderness area under certain conditions.
Well, that's right. We know of cobalt over in Lemhi County on the east side of the wilderness. The cobalt mine itself is located outside the wilderness. We drew the boundaries that way and gave some buffer space between. But if in the future cobalt should be found in the wilderness, in that belt which extends north into the wilderness from Blackbird Mine and southward as well, if any cobalt is discovered within the wilderness, the bill specifically provides that the mining of the cobalt will be the dominant use, so as to clearly allow for its mining.
I must interrupt. We're out of time. Senator, thank you very much for being with us. And Lou, thank you for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been the senior senator from the state of Idaho, the Honorable Frank Church, who is seeking another term in the Senate and has come before you with his views. This closes out our programs with the candidates. I hope you've enjoyed the past 8 weeks. Please be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.